to live through difficult emotions and complexity and all the things that war brings with itself. And hopefully we will start this safe space in 2 weeks in Sunday together with one of Ukrainian priest here in Stockholm. So yeah, and being a Ukrainian who have been living here in Sweden for almost 2.5 years, and talking about this space is not a theoretical question for me, but very lived experience. And I do feel this gap between Ukrainians and non-Ukrainians on both personal level and societal level in general. And I also do believe that working with our hearts and with our minds within such kind of brave and safe space, so we can overcome this division and this gap of experience and build the joint horizon together, Ukrainian and European horizon. And today we will start with discussion the roots of the roots, probably, because the idea is to analyze the ideology of Russkiy Mir and the role of Orthodoxy within it. And technically, the meeting will be divided into 2 parts. The first part will be the lecture by Michael Yen, and the second part will be discussion. So if you have any comments or disagreements or question during the lecture, so keep it either on mind or write it down, so for them to have the fruitful discussion. I'm glad that Michael Yen, the Dean of Sankt Ignatios and newly emerged Stockholm School of Eastern Christianity, will initiate this, will be an initiator of this Ukrainian-Swedish Forum, because he is also a person with whom we shaped the idea of the forum, with lots of conversation, lots of agreements and disagreements as well. Michael, thank you for supporting the emergence of this space, and I'm glad to say that the floor is yours.
Okay. So, I'll stand here, right? So, Russkiy Mir is one of the watershed between the future and the past. How we handle it in the Orthodox world will be probably how we handle Orthodox in the future. Orthodox as we see it today will be reshaped because of this. There's no alternative. It has to be a complete reconfiguration of Orthodoxy. And in order to understand this, we need to understand the background of Russkiy Mir, a world that promised peace. And that's what I will try to introduce you to. What is it? What does it mean? And in what way can we predict the future? Especially for the Orthodox churches, but also for Christianity, but also for the geopolitical sphere that we have in Eastern Europe, which Julia doesn't want me to use Eastern Europe. So, but anyway, the architect behind Russkiy Mir, I would say without any exaggeration, is Patriarch Kirill. That's the architect behind this. He started very early creating this idea. Already in the 80s was he active in forging this concept. But he used a different concept in beginning, Holy Rus, the Holy Russia. But Rus here for Patriarch Kirill is not Russia. It's the ancient world that existed prior to the existence of political Russia. It's the world that had its center in Kiev, which he identifies with the concept of Holy Rus. And since the 80s, he began working consistently on the idea of a world beyond the Soviet Union. And in many ways, one has to understand how he envisioned already in the 80s what potentially could happen with the collapse of the Soviet Union. So in many ways, he acted as almost as like a prophet already in the 80s. He's also the one who created the World Russian People's Council, which is also an institution that preceded both the Russkiy Mir Foundation and a lot of other institutions in forging this idea of the Rus world. And we say Russian world when we translate it, but in reality for Kirill it's Rus world, which would be the right translation or understanding of this. But the first time we have the concept of Russkiy Mir, it's actually Russkiy Mir, which is a concept that was used in a sermon in Kiev in 11th century in the Church of the Tips, which I think is a monastery now, right? Yeah, I think so. It's a monastery today on the ancient place where this cathedral was. That's the first time we have it in written form. Russkiy Mir, not Russkiy, but Russkiy Mir, which creates the first evidence of a kind of understanding of a kind of geopolitical world, but very limited to the Kiev area, not beyond that, as we know it now. Then, between the 11th century and the 19th century, it's very, very rarely used. It almost disappears in existence. But in 1830 to 1850, it's part of the Slavfield agenda. That's where we have this idea of a Rus world, which becomes a romantic understanding of this, similar to Deutschheit or Hispanidad, right? Hispanidad, that's the concept. Yeah. Anyway, it reached its peak then during 1871 and 1880 during the 19th century, where the journal Russkiy Mir was established, and where we have the formulation, the Russian world as autocratic with an advisory Zemskaya Duma and full freedom of action for the ruling authorities. Russian songs and Russian customs, fervent faith and orthodoxy, graceful and beautiful, and purity in family life, full of internal freedom, happiness and love, which is articulated by Konstantin Leontiev, 1869, which is in connection with this Russkiy Mir journal. It disappeared 1880, and between 1880 and then the modern era, it once again disappeared from the active use. Then, this guy, Metropolitan Kirill of Smolensk, Kaliningrad, suddenly brings it back, not the concept Russkiy Mir, but exactly the same idea suddenly serves. And it serves in the early 1990s when Metropolitan Kirill of Smolensk, Kaliningrad gave speeches describing the Holy Rus as a cultural spiritual space, uniting Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Russian diaspora. Fun one. And this precedes both Vladimir Surkov, who in the early 2000s created this justification of Russia's influence abroad by using that concept. It also preceded Vladimir Putin, in 2005, when he talked about the collapse of the Soviet Union as an epidemic of disintegration that affected Russia itself. But it also precedes Vladimir Putin when he first mentioned the concept of Russkiy Mir in 2001. The notion of a Rus world, Russkiy Mir, extends far beyond Russia's geographical borders and even far from the borders of the Russian ethnicity. Today we know that Vladimir Putin had close relations to the Russian Orthodox agenda concerning Russkiy Mir. So that's why I argue that Metropolitan Kirill of Smolensk is the architect behind the idea of Russkiy Mir. And this is what is said, 1992, which is very controversial, which has been discussed in various communities. The historical community of peoples inhabiting our homeland is 1,000 years old, at least for the Slavs baptized in a single baptismal font of Kiev. We have indeed become largely one people. That is why the politics of radical sovereignty cannot be implemented in our circumstances without an enormous risk of causing moral damage to society and provoking the gravest social consequences. Under these conditions, the most humane, noble and viable option would be the state's voluntary self-restraint in exercising their sovereignty. Metropolitan Kirill, 1992. And this became more or less the doctrine of Russian Orthodox Church after this speech. That became at least the Department of External Church Relations doctrine, to prohibit the creation of sovereign states. At the same time, we know it happened parallel to this, the creation of the sovereign state. So it was a failure already from the beginning. But this was the address that created the idea that we confused a little bit talking about preserving the Soviet Union. That was never the intention by Patriarch Kirill or Metropolitan Kirill. It was the creation of a transcendent understanding of not just limiting Rus to Russia, but expanding it beyond the territories of modern political Russia. And the Russian world, according to Patriarch Kirill, is just a part of the Rus world, which also embraces Ukraine and Belarus. And in the third plenary assembly of Russkiy Mir Foundation 2009, Patriarch Kirill declared that Russian Orthodoxy is the basis of a Russkiy Mir, besides language and common history. This is very important that he created the basis of Russkiy Mir is Russian Orthodoxy. And that precise input 2008 became extremely important for the modern development of Russkiy Mir, which found a partner in this club, the Izborski Club, which was founded 2012, 2 years before the annexation of Crimea, which has been extremely influential in creating the new paradigm of Russia. That was further paired with the Russian work with the Russian doctrine, with Vitaly Averyanov, Sergei Baranov, Alexander Gaponenko, Alexander Gelisyev, Alexei Komogotsev, and Nikolai Starikov, who all worked on creating the new agenda of a Russian doctrine, which became the official doctrine of a Russian state 2016. And in this doctrine, it's not possible to understand the full development without understanding the impact of Patriarch Kirill. So it runs like a red thread through the entire history of a modern understanding of Russkiy Mir, the impact that Patriarch Kirill has, both as Metropolitan and as Patriarch. In order to understand more of this Russkiy Mir idea, we have to go back to the very beginning of how theology has influenced political life in the 20th century. The one on the right hand here is Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt, he believed that all significant concepts of modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts. And he presented this already in 1922, and you know that became influential for some of the Nazi German scholars or thinkers. The idea that you bring theology into the political arena and then you create ideologies. For Carl Schmitt was very important because he based his understanding of political life on identity. So he based his political life on identity. Or you can say representation in some way if you want to do it. But identity is the key here to understand that political life which doesn't have identity cannot preserve itself. That's basically what Carl Schmitt was trying to say. On the left, we have Anna Arendt. She experienced Nazi Germany. She was a Jewish professor in America that escaped from Germany. And she warned against the situation when nation becomes state and state becomes nation. She was not against nation and states, but then they collapse within each other. Then it becomes dangerous. And she accused Carl Schmitt exactly for that. Carl Schmitt's ideology is based on the idea that the nation must be the state, and the state must be the nation. And unfortunately, we have a party that previously argued for this in Sweden, not anymore, but previously did, the Swedish Democrats, who argued that the nation is state and state is nation. It was in their party program, which is similar as Carl Schmitt. This is important to understand the ideology of Patriarch Mir. He wants to turn the nation into state, and the state into nation. There will be a different lecture to go into depth on that, but this is exactly the point. He wants the nation to become state, and the state to become nation. And if you make a parallel, there are politicians in Ukraine who has the same opinion of bringing the nation into becoming state, and the state to becoming nation. This way of collapsing state and nation. Now, why is it so dangerous? Anyone who wants to take a guess here? Why is it so dangerous to... Yeah?
Different nations in one state.
Yeah, that's very simple, right? It's one thing if everyone would be the same nation, but how many countries do we have that are actually just one nation? Hardly anyone, especially not in a globalized world. What becomes the reaction then, if you want to have this collision or collide between nation and state? You hate globalization. That's the worst enemy you can have, because globalization goes against this idea. And of course, Carl Schmitt was extremely skeptical towards globalization. While Anna Arendt believed in the opposite. She believed in globalization because of the same reason.
Deeply make some distinction between nation and ethnicity.
Yeah, I will come back to that, exactly. Yeah. I will come back to that, so stay with that. But the most important thing here now is to understand that nation and state, Hannah Arendt is not against that. But she believes there has to be a separation, a kind of distinction between them. When they collide, a totalitarian state happens. And that's exactly what she argues against. That the first step towards totalitarian states is this. The collide of, the collapse of between these things. But there's something more into this. It's this magical aura of the collapse between nation and state. The magical aura of identity as a building block in politics. And Schmitt was consciously aware that this magic had to be preserved. And he argued that the only way to preserve the identification of the state with the nation is when you lose your time and gain your space. And here's a quotation from his diaries. I lose my time and gain my space. This idea is more than just political machinery and ideology. It's also a way of acting and behaving in the world.
Can you explain it? I don't understand.
I know, I have a context. It's a way of acting and behaving in the world. Because you often believe that you have an ideology, but ideology is not everything. And today we know this, that a lot of popular theorists and parties, for example, they don't even need to have an ideology. They focus on the behavior, on the way of appearing on the stage, on the way of acting. And here, in this field, Patriarch Mir is a master player. He's one of the best how to act and behave in the public square without saying anything. And when you say it, it's not what he says that is only what you need to read and understand. It's also how he says it, when he says it. And to make this a little bit understandable, we need to use this concept chronotype, which you have. No?
We all do.
Anyway, Bakhtin is the inventor of the idea of chronotype, which explains not everything, but explains Russian machinery in politics very much. Patrick Kidd, he uses the chronotype of Holy Rus. What he does is that he uses Holy Rus from an ancient past, but he represents it in the present. And he do it in a very conscious way, which creates a kind of invitation to his audience to participate in a sacred narrative, but not in the church, but in the public square. And by doing it, Russkiy Mir is not just a political concept. It's an emotional and aesthetic concept. And also when we have had scholars trying to identify and explain what Russkiy Mir is, they fail. Because Russkiy Mir is not built on a particular ideology. It's an emotional concept that has been unifying people, both politics, clergy, artists, even sports activists have joined into this concept. It's an all-embracing concept that invites not just intellectuals, but also other parts of society. And it's extremely successful because of that. And it can be explained by this chronotype. Chronotype means that you have space and time is cast together. So suddenly in that space you have the present of the past in front of you. That's what we do in literature. But what happens when we do it in the secular arena, when we do it in the public square? That's a big question about the idea of Russkiy Mir. Now, Patrick is not the first one who does it consciously. Count Sergei Uvarov did it in the 19th century when he introduced Russkiy Mir as recreation of political space. He did it with that purpose. He's the first one who uses Russkiy Mir in the sense of a chronotype, trying to represent the ancient past into the present. But it was very short and it was not so articulated, but he's the first one, Sergei Uvarov, who uses this technique of the chronotype. The entire Slavophile group, they used it in a very specific sense. Khomyakov used the Russkiy Duch, Russian spirit in that sense. Bedyaev and Solovyov used the Russkaya idea. But all of them had this idea of recreating the spatio-temporal narrative. And that's also the Slavophile movement is an emotional movement as much as it is an ideological movement. And the entire Russian society is as much emotional development as much as it is an ideological development. And this is something that we, at least many Western scholars, miss in their analysis. Because we criticize Russkiy Mir not to have real content, but Patrick Kidd doesn't want to have real content in Russkiy Mir because it wouldn't be all-embracing. If you think about this, how would you do as a politician if you would be running one of the superpowers in the world, like Vladimir Putin is doing? He doesn't want to be part of one political party, right? He wants to be part of an ideology that transcends the political parties. So he would not belong to one single party, he would be above the political parties. And how would he do it? By using an ideology that doesn't have a content, but which is emotional and practical and connected with the institution that certainly don't belong to the political party, the church.
And using a lot of vodka.
Yeah. But the point here is that the church fits Vladimir Putin perfectly because it transcends political parties. And when it's connected with this secularized theology, you know, when you move from the Holy Rus into Russkiy Mir, then you get a theology that becomes an ideology not connected with a single political party because it doesn't have a full ideological concept.
Can you explain to me, Vladimir Solovyov and Berdiaev, how Russkaya idea, what is Russkaya idea from Solovyov? And if you put Khomyakov, how about the Kabristi? Does the Kabristi belong to Russkiy Mir?
No, but the thing is that Khomyakov and others are an example
No,
of...
Khomyakov. I'm asking precisely because you said Russkaya idea, Berdiaev and Solovyov. Where do you in your research find that Russkaya idea and how, if, I don't know, belongs to this idea of the Russian world?
Because it has the same content of emotional aesthetic settings and not just ideological settings. And it do this recreational space by moving the chronotype of the past into the present, which is the idea of both Berdiaev and
But it was not
Solovyov.
outside of the period of Romanticism that we can find everywhere else, that it's not only in the Russian space. You can find that in the German space, you can find it in the
Yeah, and what's the point?
Pan-Slavonic.
What's the point
No, I'm just asking, like, if we
what's the
how
point
we put Solovyov.
of your identification? If it ends up with it's more than this.
But no, I understand, but I would think like how Solovyov and Berdiaev could be okay, emotional, like it's I understand, but what else can be added to this idea of the Russian world now? Through
Yeah.
with particular these two. Because I would not agree totally, but I'm not going to.
On what? Come on, tell it.
No. Continue, maybe
No.
later we will.
Yeah, okay.
I'm a Slavic soul, I'm emotional.
Because you like Slava
Yeah.
views.
It's exactly what I was saying. You're emotional because you read in this book. That's exactly what is done.
No, but
What is the Russian idea, for example? Is it an ideology?
no, I'm asking, like, we can, analyze
Yeah.
from different perspectives. If you, for example, see like how Schmemann was talking about that, like about Russkaya, or концепты русской культуры.
Yeah.
It's totally, then you can see upside down. It depends how you would like to see, because you are saying this exactly like how the big is, but okay, continue, and then I will, if I find something, I will.
No, you have to speak out now. Solovyov and Berdiaev,
We will come
they
back.
use emotional structures and not just ideologies, right? Yeah?
Okay.
Or not?
No,
As
but
everybody else, so the argument of Father Viluita that everybody else used that because it was the feature of Romanticism and the
Yeah.
yeah, it was.
What's the point?
Nationhood and everything else, like you can go like it.
No, what's the point?
I don't know. Tell
No,
me.
that's not exactly what I don't either. Because even if this is used in other countries, which Russia in this era was not isolated from
No.
Europe, right?
And then even I would say
Yeah.
that was more like a pan-Slavistic idea, was more than at the time, very like at the end of the 19th, the beginning of 20th century. But I have to be quiet to continue.
No, it's anyway, if you continue with this chronotype, Patrick Kille is the so what Bakhtin is doing is that the chronotype depends on an author who invents a narrative, and then an animator performs words written by others, and then a principle committed to the message. That's a very simple structure of chronotype. And the effect of a chronotype, if you continue, if you use this now in relation to the church, then the past then is rewritten by the author in the present. The past is rewritten by the author in the present. But we use it, for example, in sermons. If you think about it. We read the gospel text, and then we rewrite it in the sermon in the present, right? It's not a complicated case. And then the past is also animated through the embodiment of the author, or representation of the author. So the priest in a sermon is not just giving us a sermon through his work, but also through his representation. That's why you have clothes as priests, for example, on yourselves. And then the audience is invited to participate in a narrative by the author. This is a sermon. And this is exactly how a sermon should be done. It's exactly what sermon is all about. It's a chronicle. But the problem now is that in politics, when we use this same style in politics, then it's not merely about the formation of one single community. Because when you have a sermon in the church, people come there to become one community. It's not a debate, it's not a discussion between people. It's about becoming one body of Christ. It's not strange. That's the purpose of the sermon. But a political discourse doesn't have that purpose. Because if it has that purpose, then the idea of unity becomes stronger than the discourse of opinions and discussions. And it's not a coincidence that we talk about the United Russia as a political name of a party. Because unity becomes more important than the political discourse. And the result becomes then that if you attack that unified discourse, then the response becomes very aggressive. And it becomes aggressive simply because you have to protect the unity. In the church, the unity is articulated by the people saying amen to your sermon as priests. But if you have a political discourse where the people are supposed to say amen, you get problems. And this is exactly the problem when we have secularized theology moving into the political sphere. Or when you have political discourse that becomes resembling sermons rather than discussions. Where people don't elect parties because of a political agenda, because people elect persons that they trust. This is where Metropolitan Kirill said in Paris, 2007, unfortunately, contemporary international law is evolving in the direction of deepening the views of various minorities on the majority of humanity. In the private sphere, the freedom to make moral choice must be as complete as possible. However, in the public arena, only those values can be supported and disseminated that are supported by the majority of the people. This is not an invented AI quotation. This is an actual quotation from what is said in Paris 2007. This means, in reality, unity in the public square. That's what he intends. And that's what he enforces. And he does it not by, putting the pressure through violence, but through this Kronthov way of arguing. So he presents lectures in the public square, but people are supposed to say amen. But it's a political discussion that's supposed to be taking place. If you then move towards the more modern era concerning Russkiy Mir, then everything can say to be recreated in a very last modern era through what is called the Russian Institute. And the Russian Institute was created in 1995 by Gleb Pavlovsky after he attended a church conference, in fact, in Greece. He created this institute, where he was extremely inspired by the ancient Greek world, Hellenicus cosmos, the Greek world, which is exactly the Russian world, and they have a museum in Athens, the Hellenicus cosmos. And then he employed Piotr Shchedrovitsky, which you see here on the right side. Shchedrovitsky, he can be, if we would like to have someone who is the father of Russkiy Mir in a political arena, then it's Piotr Shchedrovitsky, because he is the one that comes close to the present concept of Russkiy Mir. 1997, the Russian Institute produced the first issue of Russkiy Journal, which by the name Russkiy Journal indicates, but they did not use, between 1997 and 1999, they did not use Russkiy Mir, they used Mir Russkiy. And it was limited to the modern political Russia, not transcending the borders. But 1999, Shchedrovitsky and Ostrovsky defined Russkiy Mir, which became a norm for later development. The Rus world in a peaceful world, Russkiy Mir, the Mir Mirov, attracting Russians from all over the world to participate in new global meta project. So here, Russkiy Mir in the political world has been completely transferred from a very religious background into the political realm, and that's the one who made it possible. And here he has a lecture where he articulates the economic world of the background of this. The Russian Institute were heavily dependent on understanding of Solzhenitsyn and his understanding of the post-Soviet space. He had two major works, Rebuilding Russia, Reflecting on Tentative Proposals, 1990, and then he had a second one, which is the Russian question at the end of the 20th century. He is the one who first addressed the expanded territorial understanding of Russkiy Mir, where he understands that that world, so to say, is broader than just the countries of the political Russia, but he also identifies both Ukraine and Belarus as part of his world. And as you know, he got the Nobel Prize in Peace. So trying to get the picture of Russkiy Mir then. So Russkiy Mir, sorry for I failed in doing it in English. So, but anyway, the Russian doctrine, work of Russian doctrine that came from 2016, refer back to the secular theologies. The Russian Institute referred back to Solzhenitsyn, and Izborsky Club referred back to the Slavophiles. And the Chronotop way of doing it referred back to the Satya in the Holy Rus, which then became this Russkiy Mir. So it doesn't have one content, it has a lot of different contents, but Shchedrovitsky could be said to be the modern author of a political concept of Russkiy Mir, which became part of official doctrine. Yeah. Anyway, before I end this, the second thing that Patriarch created, which is also influential, is a structural thing around Russkiy Mir, which started also off with Russkiy Mir as an idea of Holy Rus, World Russian People's Council, which was created in the backdrop of political crisis 1993. You remember this crisis where you had members of the Duma that attacked politically Yeltsin, and then Metropolitan Kirill, he offered that the Department of the External Church Relations would mediate between the Duma opposition and President Yeltsin. And then Alexei II, he then invited both to visit the Nilov Monastery, which is the center of the Department of External Church Relations, and they met there. And that changed the entire position of the Russian Orthodox Church. From 1993 onwards, the Russian Orthodox Church was turned into a major political actor. And that was because of the 1993 crisis. In 1997, as a thank you to the Russian Orthodox Church, Yeltsin signed the bill making the Russian Orthodox Church the traditional representation of Christianity, which meant simply that authentic Christianity in Russia is Russian Orthodox Church.
But if I can say, again, based on the 1991 and the fall of the communism regime in the Soviet Union, and before that was persecution of the Baptists and Orthodox especially, and Greek Catholics. So Russian Orthodox Church was in this idea that after the 1991, the Western Christianity will come and help to rebuild. But as we all know, that from 1991 to 2000, it was a huge proselytism of the Russian, of the Protestant churches into Russia. So one of the things really on the field was how to stop this huge proselytism that was happening at that time. I'm not defending, I just say that besides
Let's take that discussion in another forum on what is the real reason behind 1997 bill. There's no mentioning of this, so that's a different story. Let's take the next one. Medvedev then, 2008, 10 years later, becomes the second great watershed when it comes to Russian Orthodoxy. In 2009, he reintroduced military chaplains. 2010, return of church property. In 2011, state accreditation of theological schools. In 2012, we had the confessional teaching and school curriculum. This happens parallel to the development of Russkiy Mir and the Russkiy Mir doctrine. But this guy became the most influential when it comes to Russian foreign politics. He is the one who created the later doctrine that foreign relations policy should be guided by religious traditional values, which is part also of the education of diplomats in Russia today. So you have to learn the traditional values in order to be diplomat, the Russian diplomatic corps. But in the end, yes, why is it so militant? Because until now, to counteract the Milutin, until now, I fully agree that Russkiy Mir is very common if you compare it with the Hellenikos Cosmos, the Greek world, and if you compare it with development in the national countries of Europe. Why it became militant? That's the next question. And then comes the first question. One thing is because nation was very much identified with the ethnicity. And Nikolai Mogilyansky was a professor in Kiev in the Department for Ethnography. He's the inventor of this. Soviet Union invented ethnicity and ethnology and ethnography. And it was invented in Ukraine, in fact. In 1918, the department opened its doors, and it became extremely influential in creating the Russian space. Because Mogilyansky identified what the true nation is by using ethnological criteria. And among these, for example, he identified that Belarusians, Russians, and Ukrainians are the same people. That's his idea. And this was transferred within the Soviet Union in order to broaden it even more, making all Slavic peoples into one people, more or less. Even if Mogilyansky did not agree to that, he just limited it to these three countries. But this became very important in the background of the development in the collapse of the Soviet Union. Because suddenly you had borders, political borders, established during the Soviet Union time, but now, suddenly, in Russia, they began to work with ethnic criteria. And this is where Patrick, for example, in several of his lectures, he uses the same ideas, arguing that it's more or less one people. And that became the official agenda to say that Ukrainians, Russians, and Belarusians are the same people. But it's done by more or less scientific criteria, and it was spread also to the West. Prior to 1960s, we didn't have the concept of ethnography or ethnology common in the scientific world.
What are the criteria?
And the criteria are, for example, you need to have same language, same geographical background, and then you also have other, which I won't go into detail now because we haven't time to do it, but you have also things like language in connection to spiritual foundation, for example. Bogliansky talked about there has to be kind of civilizational space that has been defined through a certain time period, for example. And Patrick Hill uses the same criteria, more or less, in order to argue for this ethnic identity of what he calls the Rus world. Second thing that comes into play here, which I will not go into deeper here, is absolute enlightenment. The absolute enlightenment in Russia is also, it exists also in the West, of course, but it stayed in Russia, which it didn't do in the West. So the absolute enlightenment is simply meant that if you have a perfect idea, you have to implement it in practice. And if you want to implement it in practice, you have to have a perfect mediation between these two. And it cannot be done through democracy. Because if you invite democracy, it means that if I have a perfect idea, and I invite you to participate in my perfect idea, and I listen to you, and if we disagree, I may even abandon my original idea, then the perfect idea will not be fulfilled. So absolute enlightenment simply means that you have to have an authority on top, which implement the idea despite the man's objection. And think, for example, if I have a perfect understanding of democracy, in order for me to implement democracy, sometimes I have to go against the masses of people. And Voltaire, for example, he believed you need an absolute enlightened monarch to implement the perfect idea. And these ideas were taken over by both Peter the Great, but especially by Catherine the Great. The idea that the court needs to be an incubator of perfect ideas, which are then implemented by the Tsar or the Queen. Then it did not disappear with the fall of the Tsar Kingdom. It continued in the Soviet Union. But instead of having an absolute monarch, you have dictatorship of the proletariat. And it continues, I would argue, in the same style in today's Russia. But now, in a modern way, it's by transcending political parties, substituting political parties with one president above the parties, making the church a super ideology, where you transfer theology into the secular arena, using behavior and things that I call chronotop here, in order to convince people to say amen, instead of creating political discussions, with an aggressive rhetoric, and in the end, an invasion of the country. But, and in this absolute enlightenment, you have the idea that Russia is a protector of the whole. In the Tsar rhetoric, orthodoxy was protector of humanity, and the Slavic people was protector of Orthodox Christianity, and the Tsar was protector of the Russian and Slavic peoples. And Stalin took over this understanding. In his famous radio speech, he said that the communists are the protectors of the true equal humanity, which is protected by Slavic peoples, and the most equal of Slavic peoples are the Russians, who are then protectors of Slavs. And it continues like this. But lastly, the really high explanatory power we find in the high levels of anomie in Russia. And anomie, if Alexei Tolstoy, he says that Russia has always invited foreign leaders to invest Russian stability, but only to end up in tears and be forced to live without clear moral and legal regulations. Now, when he says this, it's an example of how he identifies a society which has no clear moral and legal regulations. That's the definition of anomie. Anomie means a society and its population cannot apply meaningful interpretation to social reality. They feel that there is a meaninglessness in society, with high rates of suicides, high rates of dislocations of people. And this takes long to develop in a society, and it takes a long time to dismantle in a society. And this year, the project that we did 2007 to 2014, I feel very old when I look at this, where we, together with two institutions, looked at youth between 18 and 24, which are now in power in Russia. What they were thinking about various things, and this is interest in politics, and as you see, this is Germany. And 80% had a distrust in politics. They did not understand politics, 55%. 58% was bored. And here is trust in various institutions in Russia, 2007 to 2014. 73% trusted Putin among the youth. 43 army, legal institutions like courts, 42. You see, the closer you come to political discourse, the trust is lost. And when we had a poll asking the youths, can you mention 4 things that Vladimir Putin has argued for as a president? Only 23% could mention 4 things. And 23% is very low if you get it. Most of you can mention at least 4 things that the present government in Sweden has articulated. But they couldn't, because they are not voting for an ideology. They're voting for a person who is not connected with that ideology. Nobody is interested in his ideology. They're interested in his power, that he can save them from this misery that they have ended up in. And when we look at church, now someone said that, about the saving the church and so on, yeah?
Yeah. I will say
now,
many things later.
The myth that we have been given is that the Russian Orthodox Church has been rising from the ruins, and there is a huge resurgence of religious life in Russia. This is now the people that are members of Russian Orthodox Church. And you see, from 1991 until 2014, it's gone from 31 to 73%. That's high. But church attendance, 1991 it went up to 9. Now 2017 when it was close to 4%. It's still going down. There's no people that goes to church in Russia. And if you compare with Ukraine, the entire Ukraine has more people than the entire Russian Orthodox Church going to church on a Sunday. Russian Orthodox Church has not been rising from the ruins. It's extremely popular because it uses this, what I call the chronotop way of arguing. People say amen, but in the political arena, not in the church. Nobody says amen in church. Only 4% of the population goes to church regularly. And regularly is 4 times a year, if it's not baptism. So that's regularly. So then you get, it's very few. Now churches are empty in Russia. They are not few. And here is opinions. Belief in God has been going up steadily. that they believe that their religious is also going up, but life after death, you see, it hasn't changed. Which means they are not Christians. They don't believe in the Christian doctrines. It's not why they have 62% share. It's not why they have 73%. It's because identity, nation and state and church, the third one, has been colliding into one. And here you have the aggression among youths, which is extremely different from the rest of the world, even from Europe. That murders should be either isolated or liquidated. This is not surprising. We have many countries with that. But when you go to religious sects, drug addicts, homosexuals, HIV/AIDS, 24% believes that it should be isolated, not that they should be liquidated. But here, homeless children, 2% believe that they should be liquidated. Not because they want they have done something wrong, it's because of human reasons. Usually you ask here, simply answer, it's better for them to die than live in misery. This is an extremely devalued society.
To die or to be killed?
We didn't go so deep.
Yes,
But
I think that's a huge difference. If we compare the reality where people and these kids have to survive on a daily basis, and if they suggest to get rid of them somehow, I think
That's what liquidate means.
liquidate means that it's better to get
Get
a
rid of it.
needle in your arm and you die humane than you're
No.
perishing in the street.
Liquidate means somebody kills you.
Yeah.
I don't think
Yeah.
that's
Yeah. Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Who did those statistics?
We had to Christianovskaya Institute and Levada Institute, which did it, based on a Swiss agency who created the questionnaires and so on. Why?
No, I'm just asking.
Is there, do we have any do you have any idea how this has developed the last 12 years?
No, we cannot do service that functions in Russia at the moment. It's not possible to secure the validity of the results. Even if Levada Institute can do the service, we need to have people in place in Russia to make the validation of the service. We can't do it. Since 2017 has been virtually impossible to do quality assurance of the service. More or less, I would say. But there are institutes that still do things, but I will be. Of course, it doesn't mean that when you say 2% liquidation, it doesn't mean it's more this understanding that it's better for them that someone terminates their life than their life is terminated by someone else. So that's the 2%.
So kind of euthanasia?
Yeah, some kind of that. But it's still,
Western.
these are high levels of anomie in a society, which is suicidal society. Russia has one of the highest rates of suicides, or at least had it. It means that it's a suicidal society. And a suicidal society doesn't need to have an excuse for entering into war, because it gives them meaning. And the only way to turn this around is not by attacking Russia, like we often hear in media and so on. The right way is to work with, in the future with Russia, is to work with creating patterns of meaningfulness again, where the church can be meaningful to work with. But the Russian Orthodox Church at present plays with these numbers at the moment. They feed from these numbers. Because working with the unit between Kirill and Putin creates the illusion that there is a kind of strength And even the war in Ukraine increases understanding of strength. But the church needs to change its pattern to work instead with long-term meaning creativeness.
Michael, thank you very much for this. It's really excellent. And I have just one question. Again, I don't like to be an advocate here, but I belong to the generation that remembers the war before 1991. And many of these people sitting here, they were not born, and they don't know what it means to be born and educated in the communist country, as I did. So we have a period of 80 years of communism in the Soviet Union, when you have a special right, the ideology that was teaching you what is the difference between us and them, us and them, and us and them. And then now suddenly you have 1991, and I assume many of those who remember those wars when the Berlin fell down, Berlin Wall, we really hoped that Europe is going now to be open to us. So actually, then we have this period of 10 years in 1990s, and how you would say that these possibilities to work, because I was in Russia when I was able even to meet personally, face to face, Bush, Condoleezza Rice, Putin, being in St. Petersburg, enjoying, being together. We really then believed in this era of the, democratization, working together between East and West. Unfortunately, we could see that these expectations, at least I can speak from people that coming from the East, what we were expecting, we did not achieve. I do not know to say that guilty is only the East, but also the expectations from the West that we had of them are not shown to us. And I think also here we have to think about, again, not black and white, but say now you speak about when the times comes, then we are going to, work again with, Russian society. Why do you think that in these 10 years, 15 years, 13 years, even first years of Putin, I was during his first time in Russia, I was in St. Petersburg when we celebrated 300 years of the city. It was really like a European city, it was open city, it was, for example, at the time it was memorial going on, it was the idea of, Gulag, all of this was recreating, and you could see that freedom, you could freely breathe there. And because you could see these demographs as well, says murders to be killed first, and then the second are the sects. Because again, the sects, I'm not going to, I'm just saying that this idea of the West, what we got from the West was prostitution, was corruption, was the privatization, was this exposure of the minerals, and actually we saw that we were being abused in many ways. So this, I'm not saying now, and many of us ran away from it to the West. And again, you have the waves of those who were believing in the West, like Solzhenitsyn. He came and then he speaks this famous Harvard speech, right? When they saw what's going on. Now we have, after that, I have people like Tatiana Gorichova coming to the West and being disappointed. And now we can see in Ukraine what's going on in Ukraine. You can see that it's promises, but actually nothing happens. So we can say that we have problems in the East, but why you think these 10 years were not being used to build this relationship between the East and West much deeper than it was? Instead of corruption, privatization, prostitution, commercialization, and destruction, actually. To this 1990s was the miserable, nobody, I think, who remembers those years, they want to forget about those years. Inflation and everything else, that it's really like a dark age for us.
It's a big question.
I know,
Yeah.
because we have this period, and how you think And it's not the first time in the history. If you go even before, I speak about, again, except the Cabrists. The Cabrists came to Paris. And then what happened? Then we can speak about, later on, you have the revolution, you have all of this. It's very, you have the period, because you have Crimea War, you have constantly this fighting between East and West. And then also Russian world, when we speak, I see that you are putting on one thing, one nation, one language and anything else, but we can speak about the whole Siberia and all of these tribals where they have, their languages, their culture, their identity and everything else, how that to be incorporated also in this idea of Russian war that you said, well, what is actually Russian war, as well as I agree with you, like how to defend it. So we had this period of 10, 15 years, guys. And unfortunately, I think that many colleagues...
Turn it around and say it like this. We have a responsibility in this room as priests and scholars and theologians, that is to create a church and recreate a church which actually promotes peace.
No, I agree with that.
And the church doesn't promote peace at the moment. And not just in Russian Orthodox Church. It's many churches that at the moment does not reproduce peace and the narrative of peace. Not because we are not wanting to have peace. You have to be really crazy if you want to have war. But because our behavior and our unconscious ways that we carry with us through the centuries and through the decades has been reproduced in a destructive way. It's not an incident that we have this collapse in Orthodoxy, where we have parishes that have been thrown out, we have communities that have been dismantled in this wake of this situation in Ukraine. It's because we have not paid enough attention to how the church should behave in the public square. I don't believe that the church can be silent. It has to speak out in the public square, but it needs to speak out in a way that it does not produce totalitarian systems. And by using this chronotop way of understanding, we can understand that it's not good if a sermon is reproduced in the public square, because the sermon ends in an amen. A political discourse is not supposed to end in an amen, not even a lecture. And the problem here is that priests and scholars like me, we have lost track of this understanding, of what it means to be church in the public square. We need to reconnect with our past in order to understand our authentic role in it. We cannot be silent. I believe that's not possible. Church cannot be silent in the public square, because they lose our credibility if they're silent also. But we have to train ourselves, both as priests, clergy, and as scholars, how to behave in the public square. And we need a new way of training ourselves. That's our responsibility. When it comes to political arena, there's a lot of things to say about, both the bombings of Yugoslavia and so on.
Yeah, for example.
But the thing is, the churches, the Orthodox churches, needs to take responsibility of becoming consciously aware of their behavior in the public square.